The Australian outback has always been a place of mystery and danger, vast, desolate, and unforgiving. It's a land where people can disappear without a trace, swallowed by the wilderness. Secrets lie buried for years beneath the rugged terrain. But in the early 2000s, the outback became the hunting ground for one of Australia's most dangerous men, a killer who vanished into the wilderness and evaded capture for 7 years, leaving a trail of fear and death. His name was Malcolm Naden, and his story is one of chilling terror. Naden wasn't just any fugitive. He was a man with a history so dark, so twisted, that his very name struck fear into the hearts of those who knew him. His descent into darkness began in 2005. Naden, a quiet, reclusive man, was living with his extended family in Dubbo, New South Wales. He was an outsider, a man who preferred isolation, but no one could have guessed the monstrous secret he was hiding. Police launched a manhunt, but Naden had seemingly disappeared into thin air. Months passed, and Christie's family was left to grieve, haunted by the knowledge that her killer was still out there. But the nightmare wasn't over. In January 2006, another woman disappeared, Latisha Nolan, Naden's cousin and a mother of 4. She had gone to visit Naden at his home, and she was never seen again. Her body was never found, but her car was discovered abandoned near a river. Suspicion immediately fell on Naden, but once again, he was nowhere to be found. Naden had become a phantom, a ghost lurking in the shadows of the Australian wilderness. For months, police searched the bushland surrounding Dubbo, but Naden was a master of survival. He knew how to live off the land, how to move through the rugged terrain without leaving a trace. He used the outback to his advantage, slipping in and out of the trees like a predator stalking its prey. As the years passed, the legend of Malcolm Naden grew. He was no longer just a killer on the run. He was a man who had turned the vast Australian wilderness into his own hiding place, evading capture while living off stolen food and supplies. Locals began to speak of him in hushed tones, their fear growing with each passing day. Some claimed to have seen him, a shadowy figure moving through the trees, watching them from the darkness. In 2011, Naden resurfaced in the most chilling way possible. While hiding in the remote bushland near Gloucester, New South Wales, Naden shot a police officer during a raid on a campsite where he had been spotted. The officer survived, but Naden had sent a message. He was willing to kill anyone who came after him. He had become a hunter, and now the police were his prey. The shooting sparked one of the largest manhunts in Australian history. Hundreds of officers were deployed to track him down. Helicopters buzzed overhead, and roadblocks were set up across the region. But Naden was always one step ahead. He knew the land better than anyone, and he used that knowledge to stay hidden, moving from one abandoned farmhouse to the next, leaving behind only traces of his presence. A stolen meal here, a broken window there. For 7 years, Naden lived like this, a shadow in the bush, a killer at large, his legend growing with each passing day. People were terrified to go into the wilderness, fearing they might come face to face with the man who had evaded capture for so long. Every creak of the trees, every rustle in the bushes sent shivers down their spines. Was he watching? Was he lurking just beyond the tree line, waiting to strike? Then, in March 2012, after years of fear and frustration, the manhunt came to a violent and dramatic end. Police received a tip that Naden had been spotted at a remote property near Gloucester. Special forces descended on the area, moving in under the cover of darkness. Naden, the once invisible man, was finally cornered. But even then, he refused to go down without a fight. When officers approached the cabin where he had been hiding, Naden fought viciously, using his knowledge of the bush to try and escape one last time. But there was no escape. After a brief but intense struggle, Naden was captured, his reign of terror finally brought to an end. He was dragged out of the bush, his face gaunt, his eyes wild, like a man who had spent years living as an animal, always on the run, always hunted. In the aftermath of his capture, the full scale of Naden's crimes became clear. He had not only killed Christy Scholes and Latisha Nolan, but he had also assaulted other women during his time in hiding. His time in the wilderness had only sharpened his violent tendencies, turning him into one of the most dangerous men in Australian history. Naden was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, but the scars of his crimes remain. For 7 long years, he had terrorized the people of New South Wales, using the vastness of the Australian bush to hide his evil. He had become more than just a fugitive. He was a living nightmare, a man who seemed to vanish into thin air whenever the police closed in. The bushland where Naden once hid is still there, quiet and unassuming. But for those who know its history, it's a place of fear, a place where a killer once roamed, free to take life at will. The shadows that fall across the trees seem darker now, the wind more ominous. Because for years, Malcolm Naden was the boogeyman of the outback, a man who lived off fear and blood. And now, as people walk through the bush, they sometimes find themselves glancing over their shoulders, half expecting to see him watching from the trees. Because in the wild, you never know what, or who, might be hiding just out of sight. The Princess Theatre, located in Melbourne, is one of the oldest theatres in Australia and is known for its stunning performances, but also for something much more sinister. The theatre has long been rumoured to be haunted by the spirit of an opera singer who met a tragic end during a performance in the late 19th century. The ghost of Federici, as he is called, is one of Australia's most famous theatre hauntings. The story goes back to 1888, during a performance of the opera Faust. Frederick Federici, a talented English baritone, was performing the role of Mephistopheles, the demon who drags Faust down to the underworld in the final act. As the performance reached its climactic ending, Federici descended through a trapdoor on the stage as part of the dramatic conclusion. But something went terribly wrong. Federici, who had reportedly been feeling unwell before the show, collapsed backstage after his final scene. Despite the efforts of doctors, he died from a heart attack moments after stepping off the stage. It was a shocking and tragic end to a night that had started with grandeur and excitement. But the eerie part of this story doesn't end with his death. When the cast and crew were informed of Federici's tragic passing later that evening, they were stunned, not just by the news, but by the fact that several of them claimed to have seen him on stage bowing with the cast during the curtain call. The ghostly figure of Federici had appeared in perfect health, as if nothing had happened. Since that night, Federici's ghost has become a permanent fixture at the Princess Theatre. Actors, crew members, and even audience members have reported strange occurrences over the years, lights flickering on and off, cold drafts, and eerie whispers coming from the wings of the stage. Many performers claim to have felt an unseen presence on the stage with them, especially during closing performances or when productions are coming to an end. Some say they've seen the shadowy figure of a man watching from the balcony or the back of the theatre. The ghost of Federici is said to be a benevolent spirit, one who watches over the theatre and its performers. According to local law, seeing Federici's ghost is actually considered a good omen for the show's success. To this day, whenever a new performance opens at the Princess Theatre, an empty seat in the dress circle is left for Federici as a mark of respect. While some dismiss the sightings as legend or the product of overactive imaginations, the staff at the Princess Theatre continue to honor the memory of Federici. His presence remains one of the most well-known ghost stories in Australia. In the quiet rural town of Truro, South Australia, an unspeakable evil lurked in the shadows for years. The land was vast, peaceful, and empty, until one day, the ground itself began to give up its terrible secrets. Beneath the tranquil surface of this sleepy town lay the remains of young women, victims of a killer whose sadistic cravings for control and death had gone unnoticed for years. What started as a missing persons case would soon turn into one of Australia's most chilling serial murder sprees, the Truro murders. It was the mid-1970s, and young women were vanishing from the streets of Adelaide. Most were hitchhikers, girls trying to make their way through life, unaware of the danger stalking them from the shadows. One by one, they disappeared without a trace. The police were stumped, and the public was left wondering what was happening to their daughters, their friends. The answer came on April 25, 1978, when the first body was found, partially buried in the remote scrubland around Truro, an area no one would have ever thought to search. The remains were so decomposed that identifying the victim took weeks. But she was just the beginning. The body count grew as more victims were discovered, their shallow graves spread across the landscape like a horrific, macabre map. As more bodies surfaced, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. 7 young women, all abducted, tortured, and murdered, by a duo so unassuming, so ordinary, that no one could have ever guessed the horror they were capable of. At the center of the nightmare was Christopher Worrell, a charismatic man with a taste for violence and control. Worrell preyed on vulnerable young women, offering them rides in his car, luring them in with his charm. But Worrell wasn't working alone. His partner in these gruesome acts was James Miller, a man utterly devoted to Worrell, willing to do whatever he asked, even if it meant aiding in the cold-blooded slaughter of innocent girls. Together, Worrell and Miller became a deadly team. But while Worrell took the lead in the killings, it was Miller who watched, stood by, and helped cover up the crimes, too enthralled by his partner to stop him. The murders followed a sickening pattern. Worrell would choose a girl, often a hitchhiker looking for a quick ride, and offer her a spot in his car. Once inside, the women were trapped. Worrell would take them to an isolated location, far from anyone who could hear their screams, and there, the real nightmare began. The young women were subjected to brutal sexual assaults before being strangled or suffocated by Worrell's hands. The violence wasn't just about killing, it was about domination, about making them feel powerless, helpless, and utterly alone in their final moments. When Worrell had satisfied his dark urges, Miller would help dispose of the bodies. They would drive deep into the scrublands around Truro, where the dry, remote landscape made for the perfect burial ground. The women were dumped in shallow graves, left to be consumed by the harsh Australian elements. Their bodies lay there, hidden from the world, as Worrell and Miller continued their killing spree, unbothered by the ghosts they had left behind. The spree might have gone on for years, but fate had other plans. In 1977, Worrell died in a car accident, his reign of terror cut short in the blink of an eye. But even after his death, the horrors he left behind were far from over. The young women he had brutally murdered remained undiscovered, their families left wondering, hoping for answers that seemed as distant as the desolate outback. Months passed, and Worrell's death could have been the end of it. But in 1979, driven by guilt, or perhaps the need to unburden his soul, James Miller came forward. He led the police to the burial sites, one by one, guiding them to the remains of the women he had helped bury. Each discovery was like reopening a wound. The bodies were badly decomposed, their faces unrecognizable, but their suffering was clear in the way they had been discarded, forgotten by the world. Miller's confession painted a grim picture, one of manipulation, domination, and sheer horror. He revealed how he had been mesmerized by Worrell's power, unable, or unwilling, to stop the killings. As Miller spoke, the weight of what he had done seemed to crush him. The man who had stood by and watched as his partner strangled and tortured innocent girls was finally facing the ghosts of his past. But was his confession a true act of remorse, or was it simply another way to stay in control, to rewrite his role in the murders in a way that made him seem more like a victim than a monster? For the families of the victims, the discovery of the bodies brought some closure, but no relief. Their daughters, sisters, and friends had been brutalized and left to rot in the unforgiving Australian bush. The sheer cruelty of the crimes haunted the town of Truro, casting a long shadow over the peaceful countryside. Miller was sentenced to life in prison, but many believe that his confession came far too late to redeem him. He was just as much a part of the horror as Worrell, if not more so, for he had chosen to remain silent while the bodies piled up. Even now, the Truro murders remain a chilling reminder of how evil can hide behind the most ordinary of faces. The desolate graves where the victims were found have long since been covered over, reclaimed by the land. But for those who know the story, Truro is a place forever stained by the violence that took place there. The outback is vast, quiet and lonely. And sometimes, in the silence, it holds secrets that should never be uncovered. The Truro murders remind us that even the most peaceful places can hide the darkest horrors. So, the next time you're driving through the countryside and the road stretches on endlessly before you, think of the hitchhikers who vanished into the night, never to be seen again, and of the men who hunted them. Because in the silence of the outback, you never know what or who might be waiting.